Welcome again, everyone. It's time for today's sermon. We always like to be on time. I think most of us do, but some may be a little better than others. I remember the lyrics to a song from the group Chicago. Does anybody really know what time it is? Does anybody really care? I'm sure that most of us realize the importance of time. Missing an appointment for a job interview will likely not go well. I once had a candidate for a job that missed 2 scheduled interviews in a row with no good reason. Of course, they were immediately disqualified after the second missed appointment, and many would have been rejected after the first time they were late or missed their interview. My wife and I were excited about visiting the second largest pyramid in the world. We planned a cruise where we would have an excursion to the Great Pyramid in Chichen Itza, located in the Yucatan Peninsula. But before we arrived, Wilma, a Category 4 hurricane, hit our destination area. Recently built hurricane-proof piers were completely destroyed, and this left no way for the large cruise ships to dock. The cruise ships, like ours, had to dock about a half mile or so offshore. The only way to the mainland was by way of the ship's tender boats. Now, there were very limited times when they could run. So we couldn't just go ashore anytime we wanted to. Well, anyway, we were having breakfast the morning of the excursion to the pyramid, waiting for the time when we needed to go down and board the tender boat. I looked at my watch and decided it was about time to go on board that boat. I mentioned that to the couple we were having breakfast with. They informed me that I was about an hour late. I checked my watch. No, I had the right time. Or did I? You see, unbeknownst to me, we had crossed a time zone as we traveled the previous evening. We rushed down to where the tender had been, but it was gone. We were too late. There was no other boat to the mainland that would make it in time for our excursion into the jungle and to the pyramid. We didn't get to go. That was a little disappointing, to say the least. Perhaps others of us have had similar experiences. We thought we knew what time it was. We based our actions. We based what we did and when we did it on the time that we understood to be correct. But do we have the right month, the right day, the right hour, maybe the right minute? Having the wrong time can have serious consequences in some instances. And this not only goes for our relationship with the world, but also extends to our relationship with God and our understanding of Bible prophecy. So today, I'd like to take a look at time. Time is defined by the world today, and time is defined by our Creator. Let's begin by taking a look at the definition of time from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. The first definition listed is, they say time is the measured or measurable period during which an action, process, or condition exists or continues. It's a non-spatial continuum that is measured in terms of events which succeed one another from past through present to future. Well, that definition might be a little hard to follow, but I think it does reflect how most of us think of time. The second definition from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary is the point or period when something occurs. An occasion. So maybe we just got a raise at work today. Maybe it's now party time. Okay, it's an occasion maybe. But let's look particularly at this third definition of time. Here it is. It is an appointed, fixed, or customary moment or hour for something to happen, begin, or end. Can we think of any appointed times where something happens, where something begins and ends? Now we have man's appointed times for occasions such as Easter, Halloween, Christmas, as well as many others. And then we have God's appointed times. We'll talk more about God's appointed times a little later in the sermon. Let's look at how the world keeps time today. Now, for example, this was a few months ago, but when I got up to go to work on January 13th at 7:15 in the morning, it was dark outside. On March 13th, at 7:15 a.m., the sun was up and shining brightly. The very next day, March 14th, at 7:15 a.m., it was dark outside again. But confusing as that might be, most of us are familiar with the way the world keeps time today. We're not surprised by this. We understand daylight saving time and these things. But when does the day begin and end? How do we know what time it is? Well, our days today technically start at 12 a.m. Now, many people would say we start and end the day at midnight. But this isn't exactly true. Now, for example, the sun sets here tonight at 8:51 p.m. local time. It rises in the morning at 6:45. So if you calculate that, you'll see that sunrise to sunset is about 9 hours and 54 minutes. Divide that by 2, and you get half the night. And that's about 4 hours and 57 minutes. Add that to the 8:51 sunset, and the actual middle of the night, or midnight, you might say, occurs at 1:47 a.m. Not 12 a.m., not even close. The middle of the night does not occur at 12 a.m., as many of us might assume. So how is it that we're this far off from true midnight? Well, there's two answers to that probably. First, daylight saving time pushes out our time 1 hour forward this time of year. And second, we happen to live in the far western part of our time zone. It takes a little longer for the sun to reach the same angle in the sky that it would for those on the East Coast because we're so far west. But what we call midnight, or noon for that matter, really aren't in the middle of the night or when the sun is highest in the day during the daytime. It's actually very different these days. But what about the actual timekeeping? How do we keep our timepieces, like our watches and things, on time? How do we keep them accurate so we're not late for an appointment? Well, clocks that plug into an electrical outlet can keep very accurate time. They can do that because the power companies regulate the electricity's frequencies they use. The 60-cycle electrical power we have can vary slightly in frequency over time, down to 59 point something, maybe 60 point something. But the power companies can intentionally raise or lower the frequency slightly to compensate for any slight deviation in time caused by their frequencies. So electric clocks can be very accurate because of that. And many battery-powered clocks and some watches receive time signals broadcast by radio. If you didn't know that, this usually happens at night when reception's better. Most sync with radio transmitter WWVB in Fort Collins, Colorado. That time originates with the NIST, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's based on a very accurate atomic clock. Now, our atomic clocks at home, our watches, are not radioactive or atomic in nature. They just get their name from the signal they receive that originates with that atomic clock. And there are regular clocks, too, that use the time signal from WWVB to correct their time every day, since they will inevitably drift over time. Cell phones and smartwatches, they connect by Cell phones and smartwatches that connect by Bluetooth have time that's automatically kept accurate by the carrier, whoever provides you your cell signal. I know that business computer systems are synchronized in time with time servers on the internet to keep them accurate. And even without an external source to keep our timepieces accurate, the use of quartz timing in recent years ensures us that most timepieces keep fairly accurate time today. It takes a while before they drift very far from the actual time. Timekeeping today is easier and more accurate than ever before. However, crossing time zones and daylight saving time can complicate things. You know, my first flight to the west of the Eastern time zone had me arriving 3 minutes before I left. Well, that confused me a little bit, but you understand with time zones. As I mentioned earlier, I missed the boat to see the pyramid because of a time change I unfortunately was unaware of. Now, most of us are used to all this, so it may not seem that strange or awkward to us. We seem to do quite well, overall at least, keeping time on man's clock and his calendar. So despite all this, I think we do pretty well. We're used to it. We've done it for a long time. But what about God's time? God gave us a way to keep time, and a calendar that's actually a lot less complicated and easier to follow than what most of us are actually used to today, even with our modern timepieces. Genesis 1 verse 14, if you would. That's Genesis chapter 1. We'll go to verse 14. Now in Genesis 1 verse 14, the first 3 days of completion were complete. Okay, I'll get this right. I'm struggling today. I'll be all right. Let's say this again. Okay, in Genesis 1 verse 14, the first 3 days of creation were complete. Okay, we'll be reading about the fourth day of creation. Again, that's Genesis 1 verse 14. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven, and to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, and for days and years." So God placed lights in the sky to serve several purposes for us. What purposes? Well, first, they're to be for signs. The word sign here is the Hebrew word 226 in Strong's dictionary. It's oath, and it means a flag, a beacon, an omen, a mark, a sign, a token. Now, most seem to completely ignore that God told us that the lights in the heavens would be for signs. Signs that indicate often the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Hold your place here in Genesis, if you would. We're coming right back to it, right where we were, or are. Let's run over to Psalm 19, and we'll start in verse 1. That's Psalm 19, verse 1. Let's see what David says about the heavens, imparting knowledge to us, in part by the signs they manifest. Again, that's Psalm 19, verse 1. Yeah, we just sang about that. That's right. What a coincidence. I guess it was time. Okay, Psalm 19, verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utter speech, and night unto night show knowledge. The heavens actually have knowledge for us. They even contain Bible prophecy, and did so even before the Bible was written. I know that many scoff at the idea that we can learn anything from God's creation from the heavenly bodies. I believe David would disagree. Now, we've talked about this some in the past, and I hope to talk about this a lot more in the future. Let's go on to verse 3. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. So all can hear the message if we just look. Verse 4. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. This knowledge David spoke of is open to all worldwide. Again, we'll come back to this at a later time. But let's go back to Genesis 1, verse 14, where you were. I hope we held our place there. So again, right back to Genesis 1, verse 14. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years." The lights in the sky are to be for seasons. Now, many people assume we're talking about things like spring, summer, fall, and winter, those seasons. But that's not actually it. The word seasons here in verse 14 is the Hebrew word moed. It's H4150 in Strong's. It means an appointment. That is, a fixed time or season. Specifically, a festival. Now, if we look at the definition of the word feast in our Bibles, we see things like the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We find that the definition of feast there is that of a festival. The lights in the heavens are used to determine the appointed times of God's festivals, or feasts, you might say. For example, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles, which is, of course, as I said, rapidly approaching this year. So these signs in the heavens, they actually determine the appointments God has with us. But sadly, most ignore God's festivals, his appointed times today. Now, Strong's goes on to say that these appointed times are, by implication, an assembly technically the congregation. Now we know that at God's appointed times, we're to assemble to observe his festivals, what we often read as a holy convocation or a meeting. And again, let's go back to, or actually there, but Genesis 1 verse 14, just the last part. And the lights are for seasons and for days and years. The lights are also used to determine our days and our years. There's some controversy over when God's year begins. Now, many say it's when the early harvest is ready. They have people that monitor the fields in Israel to see when to start the new year. Now, perhaps they're right, but we just saw that the lights in the heavens were for years. That seems clear. Beginning of the year on God's calendar, based on the condition of the harvest, certainly sounds practical, but there is no direct reference to this practice as far as I can tell. So, which is it? We'll get back to that at a later time. But much more obvious are God's days. The sun determines our days by its rising and setting. Let's continue in Genesis, first chapter, verse 15. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven, and to give light upon the earth, and it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the night from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Look closely at verse 19. And the evening and the morning were the fourth day. So notice that the fourth day, and for that matter, all the days of creation, began with the evening followed by the morning. At least that's what it looks like. Let's look at another example where a day begins at sunset and ends the following sunset, though. Let's look over at Leviticus chapter 23, verse 32. That's Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 32. Now here we're speaking of the appointed time of the Day of Atonement, a high holy day, a Sabbath to the Lord. When are we to begin our observance of this day? And when are we to end this observance? Again, Leviticus 23, verse 32, this is the Day of Atonement we're looking at here. It shall be to you a Sabbath of rest, and you shall afflict your souls. In the 9th day of the month at even, from even to even, shall you celebrate your Sabbath. So we're told to celebrate this day from even to even, or from, well, what is even? Well, it's the Hebrew word H6153 in Strong's. It's Arab, and it means dusk, evening, night. So we're told to celebrate or observe this day, this 24-hour day, you might say, from dusk to dusk or night to night. Let's turn over now, if you would, to Mark chapter 1, verse 32. That's Mark chapter 1, verse 32. Now, in the New Testament, the original Greek word for even is opsios, and it's defined in Strong's as nightfall, or we might call it sunset as well. But again, Mark chapter 1, verse 32. And at even, when the sun did set, there you go, they brought to him Jesus all that were diseased and them that were possessed with devils. So we see here in Mark 1, verse 32, that even is really defined as the time the sun sets, or at sunset. So God's days begin at sunset and end at the following sunset. There's no daylight saving time. There are no time zones. It's actually very, very simple. In fact, sometimes we try to make it too complicated. Maybe I've told you the story before, is I was new to all this, and I wanted to observe the Sabbath the right way. So obviously I wanted to start working when the Sabbath came. Well, I was out riding my lawnmower, riding around the yard. It was getting late in the day on a Friday. I knew the Sabbath wouldn't be long to come. As it was getting closer to what I thought was probably the end of the day, the sunset, I started thinking to myself, this is going to be close. Maybe I should stop my tractor, run in the house, get on my computer, calculate when sunset would be, check the clock, then I know how much time I would have. Of course, doing that would take precious time, and that might make me run late anyway, right? So I was thinking whether I should do this or not. It occurred to me, as I turned the tractor around and headed toward the west, that I could see the setting sun. I mean, I didn't get that, right? So I could see the sun setting. I knew I had so much time, the sun was this far over the horizon. So I didn't need all that. It's very simple. The sun goes down, it's Sabbath on Friday evening. But anyway, sometimes we try to make things more complicated than they should be. God's day is very simple. But, sometimes we read our Bibles, some things like maybe the watches at night spoken of in the Bible could be a little bit confusing. In Old Testament times, the Israelites, along with most of the rest of the world, divided the night into 3 watches. Guards or watchmen kept an eye on things until the end of their watch. At that time, they were replaced by the men designated for the next watch, and this went on until morning came. Now, the 3 watches in the Old Testament were roughly as follows. They'd be something like 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., and 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. Now, of course, that varied with the rising and setting of the sun, but those are roughly the times we're talking about. 3 periods of equal time at the nighttime. Turn to Judges 7, verse 19, if you would. We'll have a little exercise here, maybe give you a test. Judges 7, verse 19. Okay, a test. That's right. Let's see if we can figure this out. Here Gideon was outnumbered, greatly outnumbered, but he defeated the Midianites. If you recall, they blew their trumpets and broke their pitchers, exposing the lamps inside. That kind of freaked everybody out. But what time of night did they do this? Again, Judges 7, verse 19. Can you tell me here? Okay, Judges 7, verse 19. So Gideon and the 100 men that were with him came unto the camp, to the outside of the camp. Now, when was this? Let's continue. In the beginning of the middle watch. And they had but newly set the watch, and they blew their trumpets and brake their pitchers that were in their hands. What time was it? Okay. The middle of the middle watch would be around midnight. 3 watches. The beginning of the middle watch would roughly be just after 10 p.m. our time. So now we know. We have an idea, right? Let's turn to 1 Samuel 11, verse 11. 1 Samuel 11, verse 11. When did Saul attack the Ammonites? When was that? Well, let's look again. It talks about this in 1 Samuel 11, verse 11. And it was so on the morrow that Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came in the midst of the host in the morning watch, and slew the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it came to pass that they which remained were scattered, so that 2 of them were not left together. When did this attack occur? We know it was in the morning watch. That was the last of the 3. So we're going to say it was roughly somewhere between 2 and 6 a.m. Wee hours of the morning, shortly before the sun came up. At any rate, it was definitely the last third of the night. Okay, so we all have this, right? So recapping, in the Old Testament, there are 12 hours in a night, 3 watches of 4 hours each. Everybody got that? 3 watches of 4 hours each. Okay, let's have some fun. Let's go to Matthew 14, verse 25, if you would. That's Matthew chapter 14, verse 25. I believe we're all familiar with Christ walking on the water. I think everyone's heard of that. But here's my question. What time of day did he do that? Or night, I should say. At least when he did it, and we read about it in Matthew 14, verse 25. Let's see. Matthew 14, verse 25. And in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. Okay, what time was this? Anybody know? What just happened here? We said that in the Old Testament, there were only 3 watches at night. So what's Jesus doing in the 4th watch? Well, in the Old Testament, what I said is true. But here indeed we see that Jesus was walking on the water in the 4th watch. Is this a translation error or something like that? No. You see, the Romans who had conquered the land, they actually used 4 watches at night rather than the 3. 4 watches of 3 hours, rather than the 3 watches of 4 hours, as we saw in the Old Testament. And of course, based on time, for the most part, anything in the Old Testament regarding watches, they were talking about the 3 watches. Once we get to the New Testament, look at the Roman occupation, and there we have 4. So that's the answer. So 4 watches of 3 hours. They ran, again, very roughly, 6 to 9 p.m., the next 9 to 12, then 12 to 3, and 3 to 6 a.m. So what time did Jesus walk on the sea? I know you know. Okay. The last quarter of the night, maybe between 3 to 6 a.m. as we might think of it. But the last quarter, the last fourth of the night, very early in the morning, you could say. Maybe that's not true, but you know what I'm saying. But the Old Testament has 3 watches. The New Testament has 4. In case that confused anybody out there. Turn to John 11 and verse 9. John 11 verse 9. I was actually at an atheist Christian debate years ago. And the atheists are trying to do everything they could to discredit the Bible, and particularly the words of Jesus Christ, because you discredit him, you've got something if you're an atheist. Well, they tried very hard to discredit the Bible, and one of the things they pointed out was that Jesus made a statement. He stated there were 12 hours in a day. But as we saw earlier, days can last much longer, or much less than 12 hours. For example, the amount of daylight today here is actually 14 hours, 9 minutes, and 8 seconds. That's pretty crazy. But again, let's read John 11, verse 9 for that statement from Jesus. John 11, verse 9. Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in a day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbles not, because he sees the light of this world." Now, as far as Jerusalem is concerned, in the middle of December, Jerusalem has 10 hours and 4 minutes of light. That's all. At the end of June, Jerusalem has 14 hours and 13 minutes of light. But Christ said there were 12 hours in a day. I suppose that means every day. And they pointed that out. They said he's wrong. He misspoke. He should know perfectly everything. So was Jesus wrong? Were the atheists right in their accusation? Well, it turns out the hours in Jesus' day were not 60-minute hours as we know them today. Back in those days, the time between sunrise and sunset was divided equally into 12 parts. Now, that's regardless of the actual length of the daylight. They weren't using watches and things like that. They were watching the sun for the most part. The length of the hour would vary with the season, of course, as the length of the day would. But they were always equal parts, 12 equal parts. And of course, the watches at night also varied in length based on the length of the night. There were indeed exactly 12 hours in the day and 12 hours in the night in Jesus' day, although the length of the hours varied depending on what time of year it was. So that may answer some questions. But it's important to know that. They didn't have wristwatches like we do today and other timekeeping instruments. So going back a little bit, how do we know what time it is? How do we know? Well, in modern times, we need to get our time from an authority, one that's linked to official time clocks maintained by our government. We might set our watches when we hear the time announced on the radio. Now, that's if we're still wearing a watch these days. Many people don't. Or the timepiece might connect itself electronically to the official time, like the devices I was talking about earlier. So we all understand that too, I think. But for biblical times, they didn't have those devices and this technology. Let's look at how they may have measured time during the daytime. Now, sunrise would signal the beginning of the first hour, of course. Sundown ends at the end of the 11th hour. But what about in between? Well, it appears that often sundials were used to divide the day into 12 equal parts. But let's turn over to 2 Kings 20, verse 8. That's 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 8. Now here we find that Isaiah had told Hezekiah that he was about to die. Hezekiah had prayed to God. God then told Isaiah that he would heal Hezekiah and add 15 years to his life. Hezekiah then asked Isaiah for a sign from God. Let's pick up the story in 2 Kings 20, verse 8. And Hezekiah said unto Isaiah, What shall be the sign that the Lord will heal me? And I shall go up into the house of the Lord the third day. And Isaiah said, This sign shall you have of the Lord, that the Lord will do the thing that he has spoken. Shall the shadow go forward 10 degrees or go back 10 degrees? He's talking about the shadow on a sundial here. Verse 10. Hezekiah answered, It is a light thing for the shadow to go down 10 degrees. No, let the shadow return backwards 10 degrees. So he's asking for the not to go forward like it's going to anyway. He wants it to go backwards. That would be quite a miracle, quite a sign. Verse 11. And Isaiah the prophet cried unto the Lord, and he brought the shadow 10 degrees backward, by which it had gone down in the dial of Ahaz. That's quite a miracle. That would be quite a sign that would convince me. King James puts it this way. And he brought the shadow 10 steps backwards, by which it had gone down on the sundial of Ahaz. So it appears they used a sundial often that divided the sun's shadow into 12 equal parts. Parts they called hours, that varied in length depending on the length of the day. In some cases, maybe all they had to do was put a stick in the ground and kind of watch them and mark that in the sand. So anyway, that's how they did that. So that's the daytime. But what about the night? How could they measure time at night? What about a moon dial? Ever heard of that? They actually exist. But the problem is the moon really needs to be full to actually use them. Now, if you think about it, at the time of the new moon, there'd be no shadow to cast. So the moon dial only works when the moon is completely full or at least very close to it. So how would they determine the time at night? What about using the stars? Now, if you look at the star Polaris, the current North Star, if you watch it during the night, it will appear to stay still. It will seem motionless. It won't seem to move at all. All the other stars in the sky, though, will appear to circle around it. They will spin around. If you go out at night, look at the stars, look at Polaris, go back out 2 or 3 hours later, maybe 4 or 5 hours later if you can, and look. Polaris will be in the exact same spot it was when you looked earlier. The rest of the stars will be rotating around like the hands of a clock. What does that do for us? They'll rotate around how often? About once every 24 hours, right? So all we have to do is realize when they move halfway around, that's 12 hours. They can calculate that just like the hands of a clock. In fact, that's probably more accurate. Well, it's good. It works out very well. And again, they could divide that motion into 3 parts in the Old Testament, and they have the 3 watches. And they could divide that, of course, by 4, which would give us the 4 watches of the New Testament. So I think we're all very familiar with modern timekeeping. But timekeeping in the Bible is actually much simpler. The day starts and ends at sundown. The night is evenly divided into either 3 or 4 watches, depending on whether it's the Old Testament or New Testament, what time period it is. The daylight portion is divided into 12 equal divisions of time called hours, but not necessarily 60 minutes. The length of the daytime hour and the length of the nightly watch, of course, will vary depending on the season. In the wintertime, less daylight, more night, and the opposite during the summertime. But for our timekeeping, what time is it right now? Well, I can look at my watch here. My good old atomic watch says it's 2:16, I believe. So that's easy enough. In biblical time, we would be currently, let's say roughly in the 7th hour of the day. But most people wouldn't think about that till you have to calculate it like I had to. And have you ever heard the expression, it's the 11th hour? Anyone heard that? Well, years ago, when the daylight ended, those working in the fields were done. I mean, they're not working after dark. There was no real light to continue with. It would be too difficult to try to do that. They had no artificial lights like we do today. So the 11th hour meant they were about out of time. They needed to finish their tasks quickly. And I believe we're prophetically in the 11th hour today, by the way. Unfortunately, there does remain some confusion regarding God's clock. There's some things we can talk about in the future. I'll give you some examples here of some confusion that does exist. For example, everyone concedes that God's months begin at the new moon. Everybody agrees with that. It's just that it seems that many can't agree on exactly what constitutes a new moon. Some say that the new moon occurs when two witnesses sight the sliver of a new moon in Jerusalem. There are people that wait for that to see when the new moon occurs and when they start the first day of their calendars for that month. Others say that, indeed, two witnesses must sight the new moon, but these two witnesses must be in the same country or perhaps the same community as us to declare the beginning of our month, which of course makes it different. Now, one issue with this would be if it was cloudy for a few days, the new month might start several days later. In fact, even sighting it causes it to appear, sighting it usually occurs a day or two later after the astronomical new moon, so it's always going to be different. But again, if there's clouds, that extends that period of time. Now, it looks as though some of God's holy days are intended to occur on a full moon. And this would seem to create a problem, since delaying the beginning of the month would push the 15th day of the month well past any full moon. So many use the astronomical new moon to begin their new month. Now, this is a time when the moon is actually dark. It's in conjunction with the sun. It's right lined up with the sun, and it's too close to be visible. And at that point, this new moon, this new astronomical moon, would have to be calculated. Although I can tell you that those watching the night sky periodically, they would know when it occurred simply by experience, simply watching the moon's phases. They'd know when it occurred. 1 Samuel 20, verse 18. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 18. I'd like to look at a reference concerning a new moon. Now, here David was afraid that King Saul was going to kill him. He was trying to avoid being at the table with him for their new moon festival that was upcoming. But notice what Jonathan says to David regarding the timing of that new moon festival. Again, 1 Samuel 20, verse 18. Then Jonathan said to David, "Tomorrow is the new moon, and you shall be missed because your seat will be empty." David wasn't going to be there. But notice that Jonathan said that tomorrow is the new moon. Not necessarily the beginning of the month. But if it's true that a new moon must be sighted to be declared, then how could Jonathan make that statement? If the new moon was to occur tomorrow, you can't say that if it has to be sighted. You can only say that if you know when the new moon occurs based on calculation. There is no other way. Now, I could be mistaken about this, of course, but it does seem very odd for him to have made that statement. And unfortunately, we don't really know a lot about those new moon festivals. But I did notice that 3 days would seem to last long enough, well, it would be about the same length of time that the moon would disappear from sight each month. Thought that was interesting. We're going to come back to this in greater detail in a future sermon. I'm anxious to do that, eager to do that. But suffice for now to say that there are many out there who disagree about which day starts the beginning of the month. So you might be wondering, what's the stance of the Independent Church of God's Seventh Day? How do we feel about that? Well, again, there's lots of thoughts out there, but at the present time, we follow a calculated calendar based on an astronomical new moon. You might notice that the first day of our Feast of Tabernacles this year is on September 21st. That's the sixth high holy day of the year, and it occurs on the 15th day of God's seventh month. And if you check, you'll find out that it is indeed a full moon. But waiting for a sighted moon would push the first day of the feast back a day or two at least, and possibly even more depending on atmospheric conditions and other factors. There would be no full moon for the feast. Also, If we based the time of our feast on the sighting of a new moon, I don't know how we could plan and reserve our sites so we could be together at the same time. Now, I realize that's a practical matter and doesn't actually prove anything. But for now, this is how we keep our months. Subject to change, of course, if we find a compelling reason to change. We're always ready to change if we find out we were wrong. There are other questions about God's clock. For example, when do those who live above the Arctic Circle observe their Sabbath, since there are times of the year when the sun never sets or never rises above the horizon in areas far to the north? There are just some things we don't clearly understand. In the cases of the people living in the north, there are several different explanations of what they might do. Some say the nearest city below the Arctic Circle. Some say the nearest city, period. Hard to say. But anyway, there are just some things we don't clearly understand. As always, I would suggest that we study and pray about these matters and do whatever we believe God leads us to do. We would like to always be able to give definitive answers to everything, but sometimes we just don't know. In conclusion, we've seen that having the correct time is very important to us and to God. God's appointed times and prophetic events will occur according to His reckoning of time, not man's. It's very important to study and understand God's reckoning of time. God's timing is perfect. He's always on time. Prophecy has been fulfilled at the exact time it was declared in the past. It'll continue to be fulfilled with the same precision in the future. We would hate to miss one of God's appointed times. So, what time is it? What time is it?